the gardener's lad, as they called him, used to come up every fortnight to cut his toenails. Now, his diaries say he cut them with the hedge clippers, but I'm not quite sure about that. I don't think that's the truth.
That's probably the hardest task the gardener's lad had to perform, I would imagine.
They can live for over 100 years.
Yeah, 150 years.
If they're allowed to.
Yeah, slow growing and slow moving.
Yeah. So you come back in another 100 years' time and just see how they're getting on.
No, you come back in another 100 years' time.
I'd love to hear now.
There's a wee spot in Ireland with culture galore, underground from Brogdare down to near Moneymore. There's no other place now west of the Bond like this part of Ireland, and they call it Lissan.
There's been a big house in this site for at least the last 400 years, and remarkably, the same family have owned it throughout that time. That's not to say that the inheritance of house and lands has always been a tale of smooth and untroubled transition, because to keep something like this intact, to pass on from one generation to the next, requires a degree of far-sightedness that this family did not always exhibit. This family tree, like any other, gives us many different personalities down through the centuries, as varied and as colourful, as industrious or as profligate, as wise or as foolish, as benign or as wicked as the times that they lived in. Many of them were memorable characters in their own right, and many of them, no doubt, had the qualities of stewardship required. But I think that posterity will judge that the wisest, most benign and most far-sighted steward of all was the most recent owner. She was the last of her family to inherit the property, and she has bequeathed the house, its contents and the land surrounding to all of us, the public. Welcome to Lissan House in the townland and the parish of Lissan in County Tyrone. That last owner of whom I speak was Hazel Radcliffe Donning, née Staples, who died in the year 2006. She was 82 years of age, and the house was about 300 years older. If you were to begin with Hazel and play the game of genealogical snakes and ladders that is the Staples family tree, then you would arrive back at Thomas Staples, who landed himself in this part of the world from somewhere near Bristol in the year 1610 at the sharp end of the plantation of Ulster. Some 12 years later, he married a rich heiress called Charity Jones, and in 1628 he was created first Baronet of Lissan and Mahon Vale by Charles I. Many judicious marriage alliances later, and many generations of climbing ladders and sliding down snakes, saw the Staples family deeply embedded in the Anglo-Irish establishment, with all the vagaries of fortune that membership of that class entailed, wealthy highs and impoverished lows. But the house here at Lissan on the outskirts of Cookstown remained a remarkably fixed point throughout all the turbulence of modern Irish history, and survived, albeit in greatly reduced circumstances, into the 21st century. Such are the laws of inheritance that, had Hazel Marion Staples been a man, she would have become the 14th Baronet of Lissan and Mahon Vale. She wasn't, and she didn't. But in any case, that would have made no difference to her financial circumstances, which were wholly inadequate to the upkeep of an architecturally unique, historically priceless, but poverty-stricken relic such as Lissan House. When Hazel went to join her ancestors in 2006, at least she would have done so in the knowledge that she had enlisted the voluntary efforts of a body of people who would take upon themselves as a kind of sacred duty the unending task of preserving and restoring the house and the domain for the benefit of the wider community. For the past decade, that charitable body, known as the Lissan House Trust, has addressed that task with dedication and enthusiasm. Tony McMinn is one of those trustees, and he is in such intimate terms with the house and its colourful erstwhile inhabitants that he speaks of them not only with authority, but also with the voice of a fond, if slightly exasperated relative. Tony, we'll start, I think, with the house itself. And the most impressive thing about this house is this incredible staircase.
That's right.
I mean, how old is that in relation to, I mean, was that part of the original design of the original house?
No, the original staircase collapsed in about 1845. We believe that it collapsed because of the weight of books in the library, which was just up above us here. Because the Staples were great travellers, and the one thing they always brought back were books, and they were just stacked up in there, and the staircase collapsed In fact, Nathaniel Staples, when he inherited the house, he came here to find the staircase lying on the ground.
Right, good job. Nobody was underneath it.
It was. The staircase, of course, was designed and built by Robert Ponsonby Staples, the famous artist.
This was after the 1845 disaster.
Yes,
in
that's
other words.
right. That's right.
But I mean, it's such an impressive. And the size of it's impressive.
Yes.
But look at the ornamentation on it.
That's right. And Hazel always used to say that because she was in the Navy at one stage, that she felt as if she was in the bowels of one of the ships looking up.
Looking up, yes, yeah. We've mentioned about 3 different generations
of
the family there. So the Staples were here really from the 1600s
That's
onwards.
right. That's right. When they first came to Ireland, they lived in Moneymore. They built a house in Moneymore, which was quite adjacent to Balachi. At the plantation, that area was being looked after, was being planted by the Vintners Company of London. And the gentleman who was in charge of the Vintners Company lived in Balachi. He was called Baptist Jones, and he had a very attractive young daughter who was called Charity Jones, which was very appropriate because that was the plan that the Stables had for her.
Right. If you want to call her Charity, I will take your Charity.
So they eventually got married and they bought this whole estate here. At the same time, they bought Cookstown, and Cookstown they paid the sum of £360 for.
Oh, right. So he was a wise investor.
He was, indeed.
So was he the man responsible for amassing some kind of family fortune in the first
They had,
place?
yes. They would have had, at its height, the estate would have been about 5,000 acres.
Right.
A lot of it was up in the Spurns because he put an ironworks in here and he needed the iron ore from the Spurns to keep things going.
So he was the industrious one?
He was indeed.
So that the house, I mean, would it have been as grand as it is now? I presume
very much, yes.
But it's been added on to since
It
then.
was added on. Thomas,
Right.
who was the Queen's Advocate in Dublin, and he and his wife, Kitty, were accepted as the two wealthiest people in Ireland
At the time,
that
seriously?
stage. Yes,
Right.
and they were the ones who added the ballroom on. And when they added the ballroom on, not only did they build the ballroom, but they also engaged a chamber orchestra who lived in the house. So, I mean,
They lived in the house?
They lived in the
They had
house.
a live-in orchestra?
They had a live-in orchestra.
Right. So that's what you do if you have loads of money.
If you have a lot of money.
So they would have
throw
been the
back.
equivalent of the sort of millionaires of
That's
the
right.
day
That's
and
right.
living the high
That's
life and so on. But there was things, if I recall, Thomas was the man. He was slightly eccentric in a way because, I mean, okay, he built grand ballrooms
Yes.
and live-in orchestras, but he used to walk everywhere.
He walked everywhere. That's
Even
right.
in his 80s, he was walking
He
from
was
Belfast to
Downpatrick. He walked to
Downpatrick.
in the records, yes.
It's crazy.
Which is at 80.
At
which is,
80, when he could have afforded a coach
He
and all the
could have
rest of
afforded
it.
the coach and horses and
Right.
the whole heap.
But over the centuries, you had all these different characters. Some of them did extremely well,
Yes.
and some of them didn't do extremely
Some
well.
of
Is
them
that fair to say as well?
Ran the house down, actually. We now have almost 300 acres of land. As I said, at its height, it was 5,000 acres of land.
By the time, if we jump forward to, you mentioned him already, Robert Ponsonby
Yes.
Staples. You have a wonderful display of some of his paintings
Yes,
upstairs, or
we do indeed.
pictures of his paintings around the pillar.
Yes.
And it's extraordinary that one man painted all of these.
All of them.
Because there's also so many different styles of
That's
painting.
right.
Isn't that right?
Yes.
So-
I mean, he'd spent a lot of his time in London
Yeah.
and belonged to the Café Royal set. But if you happened to be in having a cup of coffee, he would have been sitting with a sketchbook, sketching you.
Yeah.
And he just might have come over and said, "Now, would you like to buy this?"
Right. Because he was still looking for
He
his
was
few
still-
bob at that
yes,
stage,
exactly,
wasn't he? Right.
exactly.
So family fortunes had gone a bit thin at that
Yes,
stage,
a bit
right?
thin.
Robert Ponsonby would he'd been the grandfather of Hazel?
He was Hazel's grandfather. That's right.
And whom they called the Heffalump.
The Heffalump, that's right.
And he used to walk around in his bare feet.
Yes, he walked about everywhere in his bare feet. The gardener's lad, as they called him, used to come up every fortnight to cut his toenails. Now, his diaries say he cut them with the hedge clippers, but I'm not quite sure about that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the truth.
That's probably the hardest task the gardener's lad had to perform, I would imagine. That's not one I would have looked forward to anyway.
In London, even because as I say, he'd spent
Yeah.
a lot of his time in London, he had this habit of walking up and down the tram lines in London. Because the reason he was in his bare feet was because he felt there was a power in the ground which would have travelled up through your body, kept you healthy and helped you to live longer.
Right. So he's open to all sorts of alternative notions.
That's
and all
right.
that as
That's
well,
right.
even
And
back
of course,
in those days.
in those days, I don't think the Metropolitan Police, if that's who they were, agreed with him because they arrested him. They thought he was a lunatic.
Probably for
Walking
a
about in his
vagrant
bare
of some
feet.
sort. Yes,
Exactly.
Yes.
But he hobnobbed with all the great and the
Oh
good of
yes,
the day, didn't he?
the Prince of Wales was one of his great friends.
Right.
And there's although we've no actual proof of it, but we think that the Prince of Wales and Billy Langtry did stay here in the house.
Well, they wouldn't have advertised the fact,
No,
would they?
no, definitely not.
He was friendly with Oscar Wilde.
He was
as well.
great friends with Oscar Wilde.
I'm trying to think who
And
else.
Ponty himself was a bit of a home ruler now.
Right.
And he had lots of friends who were involved in that end of things.
And the nationalist politics of the day,
That's
in
right.
other words.
Yes,
Right. So he was a colourful character, to say the least.
To say the least.
A colourful character who painted this colourful picture of his grandchildren, Hazel and her sister, at Christmas. It was far from live-in orchestras they were aired. When Hazel inherited the property, but not the baronetcy, there was little left of any family fortune. At the age of 17, she joined the Merchant Navy, saw action with the Atlantic convoys during the Second World War, joined the Women's Royal Air Force, became a pilot, and delivered Spitfires from the factory to the airfield for male pilots to fly into battle. Something, Tony tells me, she thought herself well capable of doing.
I mean, I think she resented the fact that women couldn't inherit the baronetcy.
Yes.
And I think a lot of her life would have been spent trying to demonstrate or prove that she was
That-
good as
yes.
any man, in other
That's
words.
right. Oh, yes,
that's
very
fair.
much. I mean, she effectively did the work of a man on the estate.
Right. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty.
Oh,
when she
no,
was back
absolutely
here.
not. No.
I see.
And,
And she
nothing
didn't have a whole covey of servants at that stage.
There were no
obviously.
servants here.
So
She lived here up on the very top floor for 18 years, all on her own.
Before that, she had married, well, it probably would have been a distant cousin of hers.
Yes,
really.
that'd be, yes.
That's Harry Dolling.
Harry Dolling.
And she, I mean, as far as I understand it, she came back here and he had been the land agent or the agent for
He
the
was
house.
what we would call the farm manager.
The farm
yes,
manager,
yes.
right.
The story that Hazel told us was that she first met Harry when she was 9 years of age because he was working here, and she told her mother that she had seen Harry and she loved him, and that was the man she was going to marry. Now it took 40 odd years before that happened.
So 40 years later, she
because
says,
Harry went
finally.
married somebody else. But they did get married, yes.
So when Harry's wife died, they married.
They married.
He was 25 years older than
He was
she
25 years older than she was, and she was in her 50s at that stage. Right. But they had a very successful marriage. They enjoyed life, and they were married for 16 years before Harry died.
Right.
The Staples family, about whom there's many a story still to be told, tended to live into ripe old age. But in the river that runs alongside the house, there are creatures that could outlive them by half a century and more. The freshwater pearl mussels of Lissan Water, when we come back. It wasn't until the year 2004 that Lissan House came to be lit by mains electricity. Prior to that, it relied on a none-too-reliable turbine that had been installed in 1902, powered by the adjacent Lissan Water. The two men you see clambering into the river are going to retrieve something they left here some months ago as part of an experiment to see if a certain species, which is under serious threat, can be introduced to the Lissan Water in the hope that it will thrive here. That species is called the freshwater pearl mussel.
When I tell you that the freshwater pearl mussel can live for well over 100 years and that the female mussel can release literally millions of microscopic larvae into the river for most of those years, then you could be forgiven for thinking that our rivers must be jam-packed with them. Alas, no. They might have been at one stage, but in this river, for example, the Lissan Water, they're extinct. Now, we humans have certainly contributed to that situation, either by polluting the water or by reckless and wasteful harvesting in search of pearls, an activity that has now been made illegal in a desperate attempt to stop them being wiped out completely. But another reason why freshwater pearl mussels are so thin on the ground, or on our riverbeds I should say, has to do with the incredible odds a new mussel has to overcome in order to survive. Each tiny mussel is less than a millimetre in size when it's released along with millions of others into a fast-flowing river current. And the only way it can prevent itself simply being washed away to oblivion is by being lucky enough to meet a very obliging juvenile trout or salmon which will allow it to attach itself to the inside of its gills where it hopes to live for the next 6 months or so.
all of which presupposes a healthy population of trout or salmon in the first place. But that's another story. Meanwhile, Frank Mitchell and David Bell from the Ballinderry Rivers Trust have located what they call a silo containing their experimental mussels which had passed the trout gill lodger stage before being exposed to the environment of the Lissan water.
So the whole purpose of this is to measure what?
It's just testing out will it be a suitable site for release in the future.
Do you think in the past there were freshwater pearl mussels growing in this river here? Is that your thinking?
Well, I mean, when we done a survey in this river, we had come across shells in the lower end of this wee river here.
Right.
So that lets us know that there have been mussels in this catchment a number of years ago.
But not in recent years?
Not in recent time. Any survey or searches we have done, we've never seen no mussels.
What do you think would have been the cause of their disappearance here?
Most likely drainage. Drainage would have been a big thing initially. It would have pulled a lot of mussels physically out of the river, scattered them across the land, you know.
I understand.
But, you know, young mussels falling off the gills of fish need well oxygenated gravel, but silt can smother them, you know.
If you get too much bottle silt, it comes down the river and it will actually suffocate the gravel.
Right.
So if you get a bit of a good silk where you get a bit of algae, it grows on the stones.
Right.
Then the young mussels of this size will actually feed off that
I see.
till they get to a filter feeder stage,
Right.
and then they're actually filtering the water at that stage. So
But you also need a river that has trout in the first place,
yeah.
so that these wee guys, these larvae, will survive.
Well, then obviously if they're going to start breeding and we don't have any trout in the river, well then they're not going to multiply in future years to come. So
It's an extraordinary relationship, isn't it? When you think
it's a
about
big
it, you know?
relationship, yes.
Unlikely.
Yeah. So if you've no trout, forget about it.
That's not the biggest problem. It's the survival after they drop off the gills of the fish 9 months later, you know.
This is what you're looking at now.
This
at
is
the
what
moment.
we're looking at now.
So you put these guys in here how long ago?
Last summer.
The concrete silo anchors a tube protected by gauze at either end through which the river water is filtered. Frank and David have been monitoring the survival and growth of the tiny mussels for the past 6 months. Each one is colour-coded and numbered, and while David shows off his young eyesight and accuracy with the calipers, Frank carefully records the measurements.
I can hardly see the mussels. Never mind read numbers on them.
White 30, 13, 23. He thinks I'm bluffing at the time.
That's why I like to take the young youth with me here. He
Oh, well,
can see very well.
You and I, Frank, will be there all day.
Too many birthdays.
What size is that?
Oh, hold on. Thought I told you.
Hey boys, concentrate here. No crack.
No crack. You put me
White
off.
50, 1289.
12 got it?
Yeah.
So David, can you tell now, even at this stage, without checking your records, these definitely have grown since the last time you looked at
Yeah,
them?
they would have, yeah.
So
they do grow very slowly, so it can be
Oh,
hard
naturally.
to, yeah.
I mean, they can last. They can live for over 100 years.
Yeah,
if they're
150 years.
if they're allowed to.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So you don't know exactly.
Slow growing and slow moving.
Yeah. So you come back in another 100 years' time and just see how they're getting on. in other
You
words.
come back in another 100 years time.
I'll not be here now. But anyway, so far you're pleased with the results anyway of this. Is that right?
Seems to be going well, yeah. There's very few mortalities so far.
Right. And what's going to happen ultimately if you're happy saying, yeah, this water does the job?
Well,
Will you just plant it?
Well, we'll do a survey and look for a site where we think they'll stay firm and there's good fish densities, you know, suitable for release.
The restoration of the Lissan water to its former state of biodiversity mirrors the restoration of Lissan House. Both suffered considerable degradation throughout the 20th century, and the current custodians of both need the goodwill and the voluntary support of the wider community if they are to preserve them for posterity. Dan Neeson lives at the end of the rear avenue into the estate, and he well remembers the days when he was slightly younger and fitter, having to carry a ton of coal up the back stairs to Hazel Donning's little top-floor apartment every 3 weeks. But Dan has something else besides memories that he wants to preserve with regard to Lissan: the townland names of the parish.
But sure, as you know yourself, in recent years, the powers that be have done away with townlands and replaced them with house numbers and road numbers. And they tell me as a result of that, if you ask a child in the school today, what townland do you live in, they would say, we don't live in such and such a number on such and such a road, which I think is very sad, because the generations that went before us were very proud to be identified with their townland.
And I imagine whenever you were a child, you had just your family name
Yes,
and
that's
then the
it.
name of the townland.
That is right,
And
yeah.
that was all.
That is all, yeah.
Everybody with any sense
Right.
will realise that you're right,
Yeah.
that it's very important to keep the townland
Well, it
names.
is important, surely.
Because
yeah.
it's history, it's
Yeah.
geography, it's describing the place that
That's
you live
it,
and all
yeah,
the rest.
yeah, that
Right.
is it.
Okay, so the modern system might
Yeah.
be more accurate.
Yeah, well,
than
I
you
don't know
now,
what it is. I think it's very confusing.
Do you think so?
Aye.
Right.
Well,
This is your chance to make a stand for the townlands here now. Then, all right. Another talent of yours, right? Besides lugging tons of coal upstairs, is writing poems.
Don't blow ahead on me now.
No. But I mean, you're well known, and in fact, one of the publications produced about Lissan House had one of your.
But it had,
your
Mrs.
poems on
Darling
the back of
actually
it.
requested that one time. I remember walking out on the avenue one morning very early, and the next thing I looked around and she was at my elbow. And this is what she wanted me to do to put this wee song on a tip.
But it contains. We're talking,
It contains 30 townlands, actually.
30 townlands.
Yes, yeah.
So you put all the townland names under these verses. Of
Yeah,
this, of
that
it.
is it, yeah. That is it.
And would you really remember it? Would you recall it now?
Oh,
Would
well,
you?
I could make an attempt anyhow.
Well, give us a few verses with lots of townland names in it.
Right,
Because
right.
one of the hardest things on earth, I would imagine, is to get townland names to rhyme with other townland names. Is that part of what you had to try and do as well?
That's it.
Right.
But sure, it pleased me and sure everybody else it doesn't.
Well, listen,
This
go
is
on.
it.
Please yourself now at
Right.
the moment anyway, and give us a verse or two.
There's Crevan, Clunty and Crevan Kinneys, was Davan, Balnagilly, my boy, Ballybreast, Clag and Fiarn and Old at the Run, just places to call in whenever you can. Knockadoo and Dernan and Derry-Gennard, Drumeen and Drumrod and even Drumard. There's a wee place called Baraka that's out on its own.